The house where I raised my son used to be the heart of my life, a place where every corner held a memory, every wall carried a sacrifice, and every morning felt like a promise that everything would work out. I remember opening the windows and breathing in the smell of damp earth mixed with the coffee I brewed before the day even began. I remember his laughter running down the hallway, the toys scattered across the living room, and that constant feeling that the house itself was an embrace. It was there, on that old couch, that I watched my little boy grow, imagine, dream. It was there that I kept the quiet certainty that no harm could ever cross that front door. And before I go on, write in the comments where you're watching me from, your city, your state, and especially your country. That part matters. This story crosses borders, and I want to know how far it reaches, because I know that so many women, from the United States, Jamaica, Angola, Mozambique, and countless other places around the world, carry wounds just like mine, no matter where they're living right now. With time, the house started changing without me noticing. It didn't happen overnight. It was like a shadow slipping in slowly, spreading through the corners. Little things disappeared first. The soft thumping of excited footsteps, the casual conversations at the end of the day, the smell of food that once pulled him toward me. In their place came long silences, the kind that don't belong anywhere. Silences that weigh, that measure, that watch. Still, I tried to keep everything as it had always been. I set the table the same way, folded clothes with the same care, filled the rooms with light like I always did. But the light didn't seem to reach him anymore. He spoke less, looked less, listened less. Small moments of coldness started slipping into our routine as if they were normal. And a mother always tries to believe it's just exhaustion, just a rough patch, just something that will pass. But deep down, the heart knows when something is shifting. It knows even before we admit it. The living room, which had always been the liveliest space, started to feel tight. I'd walk in and feel the difference in the air. The couch, where he used to drop down laughing, didn't receive laughter anymore. The hallway, where he once called my name while running toward me, became nothing but a quiet passage. Even the kitchen lost its warmth, the place where we shared stories while dinner simmered on. The stove turned into a territory of measured words, cut-off glances, held breath. And even with all of that, I kept trying to fill the house with whatever joy was left. I tried to recreate a scent, a memory, a routine that could bring us back to who we once were. But the house seemed to know that my strength wasn't enough anymore. As if it, the same house that once witnessed our happiest seasons, was trying to warn me that something much bigger was on its way. And it was exactly at that point, the point where the house stopped feeling like home and became just a space filled with silent signs, that I felt my life was about to twist completely, even though I was still fighting to hold together the last pieces of what remained. His change began like the sound of a chair dragging across the floor. First a distant noise, then a presence that could no longer be ignored. I sensed it in his tone of voice, in the way he answered, in the way he looked at me as if I had become some kind of inconvenience inside the house I built with my own hands. It was a slow transformation, but precise, the kind that creeps in through the cracks and settles into the corners before you can name it. He began to complain about everything, the food, the temperature, a noise that wasn't there. And every harsh word hit straight into my chest because it wasn't just impatience. It was a coldness I had never seen in the little boy who once smiled at me with baby teeth and tiny hands asking for a hug. Now the man standing in front of me carried a hardness that had no clear origin, but fell on me like a storm. I tried not to respond, tried to breathe deeply, tried to believe it was just a bad day, then 2, then 3. But the truth is that behavior grew roots. Deep ones. Whenever he walked through the door, I felt the energy shift. The air got heavier. The walls seemed to shrink. And inside my own home, I began measuring my steps, thinking before speaking, moving slower, making sure a door didn't slam, a chair didn't scrape, that I didn't make myself noticeable when he was irritated. It's strange to think that I, the mother, the one who always protected, always held everything together, now walked through my own house like a visitor, an unwelcome one, at that. The explosions became routine. He raised his voice over the smallest things, and I kept wondering if I had said something wrong, if I had done something without realizing. I tried to recall every detail, every word, every breath, as if I could trace the exact cause of this violent shift. But there was no logic, no reason. It was as if he had brought home a storm that never belonged to me, but that always landed on me. And each explosion left marks no one could see on the outside, but tore me open on the inside, because there is no deeper pain than the one caused by someone we love more than ourselves. The worst part wasn't the yelling, or the criticism, or the rudeness. The worst part was the silence, a cold, cutting silence that dragged through the house like a shadow. He walked past me without looking, as if I were invisible. His presence felt like a weight on my shoulders, and when I tried to start a conversation, he answered with short, impatient sentences, as if every word I spoke was a mistake. The living room, once so alive, became a field of tension. The kitchen turned into a minefield, and I, who had always been the owner of my home, found myself moving like someone trying not to wake a monster. Each day I felt the coldness growing in him, a coldness that couldn't be explained, but could be felt, an emotional distance stretching between us like a rubber band about to snap. And I tried to hold on, tried to pull him back, tried to find any trace of the boy I once knew. But he hid behind a hardness that didn't match the child I raised. I looked at him and searched, inside that adult face, for the pieces of my little boy. Sometimes I found them, but they stayed buried under a kind of anger that came from somewhere I didn't know and fell entirely on me. And no matter how much I tried to understand, no matter how much I tried to get closer, no matter how much I tried to remind him and myself of everything we once were, the truth was that I was losing control of the space that should have been my safest place. The house became unstable territory. It felt like walking on eggshells every single day. I knew that any small move could trigger another wave of irritation, and that constant alert drains the soul, drains the energy, and forces you to ask yourself when love turned into warfare. I was still holding everything together, still trying to be calm, still trying to be the balance in the middle of chaos. But inside, I was already exhausted from trying to stop the house from collapsing on both of us. And that's why, if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. Because this is the only place where stories like yours and mine are told with truth, courage, and the strength that so many women need to hear. You need to stay here with me. You need to follow this until the end, because this story is going to touch the silence you've been carrying for a long time. And I promise that every word that comes next will reach exactly where you've never dared speak out loud. The house no longer felt like mine when the first explosions started happening. It was as if every corner had lost its breath and was just waiting for the next impact, because he walked in carrying an energy that pushed everything away. It didn't matter if I was sitting, cooking, folding laundry, or simply trying to exist. Any movement became a reason for another emotional storm. I could see in his eyes that the anger wasn't really about me, but I was the one who received it. And when the rage didn't come in shouts, it came in slamming doors so hard the whole house trembled. The wood echoed as if it were screaming for me, as if begging me to notice what was becoming routine. The slam of the door turned into a constant sound, a warning that another conflict was about to begin. The arguments had no storyline. They didn't start from anything real. All it took was a simple phrase from me, something like, "Are you okay?" or "Did you eat?" And he would turn his face away in that harsh, defensive way, as if my words were attacks. Sometimes he said I was pressuring him, other times that I never let him have peace, and every time the feeling was the same. I had become the target of a war that wasn't mine. A war made of his accumulated frustrations, his broken decisions, the disappointments he wasn't willing to face. And because he knew I could handle it, he poured everything onto me without measuring the damage. If you've lived anything even close to this, comment, "I felt that in my skin." Because sometimes only those who have walked through that kind of storm truly understand the weight of these words. The conflicts grew fast. Some days he accused me of things that made no sense, said I made his life harder, that I held him back, that I lived in the past. I tried to understand his logic, tried to find a reason, tried to see where I had gone wrong, but there was no answer. No motive, no solid ground. It was all emotional discharge, raw and disorganized, coming from him and landing straight on me. He spoke as if I were responsible for his failures, for the dreams that didn't happen, for the stumbles life placed in his path. And no matter how much I tried to breathe and stay calm, it was impossible not to feel how deeply every unfair word cut. But the worst part wasn't the yelling, it was the air afterward, that thick, frozen silence that hung in the room like a heavy cloud. I'd walk through the living room and feel his eyes following my movements, as if looking for a reason to start another fight. I'd pass through the kitchen and find myself silently hoping he wouldn't walk in at that moment, just to avoid another explosion. I learned every detail of his mood, not to get closer, but to try to predict the next storm. That is not living. That is not home. That is not love. If you understand what it's like to walk around trying not to awaken someone's fury, comment, I recognize that weight, because naming the pain is one of the ways we stop it from swallowing us whole. With time, looking at him became an exercise in pain and memory. I tried to find in his adult face the little boy I raised, but it was like searching for light in a room with all the windows shut. The frustration he carried on the inside overtook everything. I wondered where all that rage came from, but always arrived at the same silent truth. It wasn't about me. It was about him, about a world that hadn't been kind, about a life that demanded more than he could give. But knowing that didn't soften the wound. I was still the one taking the hits. I was still absorbing the impact. I was still trying to survive the thick tension that dominated every corner of that house. The days started repeating themselves, arguments that led nowhere, doors slamming before any thought could even settle, accusations that had no connection to reality, and a kind of loneliness that only exists when you live beside someone who no longer sees you. This kind of loneliness weighs differently. It settles slowly, taking the place of hope, making you ask yourself how long love has to hurt before people stop calling it love. If this part is speaking to something inside you, comment, I don't deserve this, because many women need to read other women saying what they never had the courage to admit. And every time he took out the weight of his whole life on me, I felt another piece of the house crumble. Not physically, but emotionally. The place that once protected me had become the stage where I fought to keep my identity, my balance, and my faith. I held on tightly, but the weight growing on my shoulders told me this war was far from ending. Had a steady voice, who always knew how to stand her ground, who always found a way to protect both of them, began filtering every sentence before speaking it, like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. But there was no water there. There was fire. And every word could be the spark for another explosion. She began to shrink emotionally without even noticing. She stopped finishing her sentences, stopped explaining simple things, thought 2, 3, 4 times before making any comment that could be interpreted as criticism. That kind of exaggerated caution that only exists when love has become a trap. The house that once gave her comfort whenever she walked in from outside now demanded from her a smaller posture, an exaggerated softness, a silence so heavy she sometimes felt she wasn't breathing right. And it's heartbreaking to think that a mother who gave so much, who held so much, who carried so much, had to make herself smaller inside her own home just to avoid more war. If you've lived anything like this, comment, I've folded myself inward, because writing that can be freeing for anyone listening. She woke up earlier than everything and walked through the house with carefully measured steps, almost like someone walking through a place they don't recognize. She made coffee trying not to make noise, even knowing he wouldn't wake up from the sound of cups, but would wake up in irritation if the kitchen wasn't exactly the way he wanted. It was that kind of silent fear that held on to her. Fear of placing a dish the wrong way. Fear of speaking at the wrong time. Fear of being seen as an inconvenience inside the home she fought so hard to build. And that fear wasn't the kind you scream. It was the kind that eats at you from the inside, settling slowly, making you forget who you really are. She took smaller steps, both inside and out. Sometimes she wanted to talk, to share something from her day, but gave up before trying. Experience had taught her that any attempt at connection would become another accusation, another criticism, another wave of tension. The son who once looked at her with bright, curious eyes now saw in her the reflection of his own frustrations, and that silenced her even more. The mother slowly stopped existing, replaced by the survivor. The strong woman began hiding behind the one who did everything possible to avoid another storm. because her body and soul could no longer handle one more. She began shrinking in the small things too. She stopped cooking what she liked, stopped watching the shows she used to keep on quietly in the background while cleaning, stopped putting flowers on the table, stopped turning on the warm yellow lights that always made her feel comfort. It was like she was erasing pieces of herself so she wouldn't bother him. And that, for any mother, hurts more than any harsh word, because she knew she was setting aside the beautiful parts of herself to protect someone who hadn't protected her in a long time. One day, while tidying up the bedroom, she realized she was speaking softly to herself, almost like apologizing to the air, apologizing for existing a little too much, apologizing for trying to keep the house alive, apologizing for things that should never require an apology. And that was the moment she realized the war wasn't only with him, it was with herself too. Because love, when it turns into emotional violence, steals more than peace. It begins to steal identity. Comment, I don't want to disappear inside myself if this hits a part of you you've been trying to hide. She started noticing how her posture had changed. Her shoulders were always tense. Her hands shook without reason. Her eyes avoided confrontation, avoided contact, avoided anything that could trigger another conflict. Sometimes she felt as if she were walking around with a thin layer of glass covering her skin, terrified that any word from him could shatter her. The dignity that had always carried her through life was still there, but it was shrinking, as if trying to find space to breathe under the weight of unfair demands. She tried to hold on to some trace of normalcy. She cleaned the house the way she always had, organized drawers, folded clothes, swept the floor. But her movements were automatic, mechanical, almost as if she had become a spectator of her own life. She was no longer the mother who guided, who decided, who filled every corner of the house with her presence. She was a tired woman, worn down, trying to love someone who was no longer there. He wasn't in the conversation, wasn't in the glance, wasn't in the listening. He was lost inside himself, and even though she stayed, he was pushing her out emotionally. On the hardest days, she questioned who she had become, where her old strength had gone, where her voice was, where the dreams, the desires, the small joys that once colored her routine had disappeared too. She watched herself erase pieces of her own identity so she wouldn't bother him, so she wouldn't trigger him, so she wouldn't start another argument. And that made her more fragile, quieter, further away from the woman she used to be. If this part speaks to you, comment, I don't want to lose my voice, because that's exactly what happens when love demands too much silence. She went to sleep on the edge and woke up on the edge. Some days, she felt the whole house weighing on her shoulders, as if the air itself was thick and demanding more than she could give. She tried to take deep breaths, tried to find strength in small routines, tried to believe that everything was temporary. But deep down, she knew it wasn't temporary. She knew something inside her was slowly disappearing. And when a mother starts losing herself, the world around her collapses in a different way. And even then, even shrinking, even quiet, even wounded, she still tried. She tried to hold on to a thin thread of peace, tried to prevent the war he created every day from destroying the last bit of home she kept inside herself, tried to survive the forced silence, the emotional absence, the daily exhaustion that turns any woman into a shadow of who she used to be. And as she kept trying, she knew that path was far from reaching its end. That day, I woke up already feeling that something in the air had changed. The silence in the house had a different weight, a different temperature, a different kind of warning. It was as if the walls were watching me, waiting for the exact moment everything would fall apart. I tried to follow my routine like always, carefully tidying the kitchen, folding the blankets on the couch, turning on the living room light with that automatic gesture I repeated even on the hardest days. Those little rituals were my way of keeping some fragment of normality alive, some echo of the woman I had been before the emotional war started. But that day, no matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed to fit. The air felt heavy, the floor felt colder, and every step tightened my chest, as if I were walking inside a premonition. He walked into the living room with his face closed off, his eyes dark, his body tense like he was holding an entire storm inside. I recognized that look instantly, the silent warning that something very bad was about to happen. It wasn't simple irritation, it wasn't a passing bad mood, It wasn't discomfort. It was something else, a hardness I had never seen so clearly. I took a deep breath, not to calm myself, but so the anxiety wouldn't spill into the room. And I kept moving, adjusting pillows, straightening objects, trying not to trigger anything, even though I didn't know what could trigger him anymore. He started speaking in a low voice, short sentences, sharp and cutting. I listened, answered carefully, tried to keep my tone neutral, but his tone rose quickly, like a match lit too close to the wind. One word piled on top of another, and each sentence came loaded with accusations I never deserved to hear. He said I smothered him, that I ruined his life, that I was a burden, that I was useless now. Words so absurd that for a moment my mind couldn't process. I stood there, holding a pillow as if that soft object could protect me from the impact coming my way. And if you've ever heard something that tore you open from the inside, leave in the comments, I didn't deserve that. Because sometimes reading that from other women is the hand someone desperately needs right now. I tried to answer, tried to understand where all that violence was coming from, but the moment I opened my mouth, he exploded. It was as if everything he had been holding back found a crack to come out all at once. He stepped toward me with a hardened face, his eyes full of such intense anger that for the first time, I felt real fear. Not fear of being hit, not fear of physical violence. It was deeper. It was the fear of realizing that the person you love no longer sees you as human. He said things no mother should ever hear from her child, words that slice, that stab, that leave invisible wounds on the outside but bleed heavily on the inside. And then came the gesture that changed everything. He slammed the cabinet door so hard the glasses rattled. Then he pounded his hand on the table, not to make a point, but to intimidate. Then he turned toward me with a posture so aggressive, so tense, so charged with fury that I felt my heart drop inside my chest. Something inside me broke, not a small crack, not a light fracture, something big, deep, irreversible. It was as if the woman I had been for years split in half right there in the middle of my own living room. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My body froze. My face didn't move, as if it were trying to survive that moment without showing the pain that was ripping through me. People say the body knows before the mind when something has changed for good, and my body knew. It knew that nothing would be the same from that point forward, that I would never return to who I was, that a boundary had been crossed in a brutal and definitive way. He kept talking, kept throwing harsh words, kept letting the fury spill over me, but I wasn't absorbing it the same way anymore. It was as if the hit had been so forceful that my heart shut down to protect itself. When he turned his back and kept ranting, slamming things into the sink, stomping across the floor, I stood there, staring at my own hands, trying to understand what had just happened. If you've ever experienced something that shattered you without touching you, comment, "That went right through me," because some pains are completely invisible to the world, but unbearably real to the one who feels them. I walked down the hallway slowly, as if moving through a bad dream. Each step felt too heavy. The whole house felt tilted, as if it were pushing me away, warning me, trying to tell me something. When I reached the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the air leave my chest as if someone had pulled everything out of me at once. It wasn't ordinary sadness. It wasn't anger. It wasn't exhaustion. It was rupture, pure rupture. It was the exact sensation of realizing that the love I gave, the love I built, the love I held together for so many years had been crushed like that. And right there, in silence, I understood that this had been the day he crossed the line, the day my life split into before and after, the day the wound became too deep to ignore, the day I unknowingly started saying goodbye to the woman I had been, because from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. And the road ahead would demand a strength I didn't yet know I carried. I remember the exact moment my body could no longer hold the war he had unleashed across the entire house. It wasn't fainting, it wasn't collapsing, it wasn't falling. It was something else. It was as if my soul felt the weight of all the days I had to be strong, and finally said, "Enough." There was no shouting, no harsh response, no attempt to fight back. There was only the moment when my legs finally refused to hold the posture I had forced myself to maintain for far too long. And when my knees gave out beneath me, I realized I wasn't collapsing out of weakness. I was kneeling because it was the only position where the weight of the world didn't crush me completely. The house was silent after his explosion. Those harsh words were still echoing. Through the walls, as if they had been pushed deep into the concrete, he had stormed out, slamming the door and leaving behind the trail of his own chaos. And for the first time, I didn't follow him, didn't try to fix anything, didn't try to smooth out the emotional wreckage he had dropped in my lap. My body stayed still in the middle of the living room, and it felt like all the energy, all the air, all the movement had been sucked out of me. My hands trembled, my eyes burned, and a pressure in my chest reminded me of every pain I had swallowed just to keep standing. Then came the knee, just like that, as if my body made the decision for me. Go down, just go down. And when I found myself kneeling on the living room floor, my palms pressed against the same rug that had witnessed so much of our life, something shifted inside me. The noise stopped, the war paused, not outside, inside, because outside, the storm was still roaring, but inside me, a door had finally closed. The pain was still there. The disappointment was still there. The exhaustion clung to every muscle. But there was a new silence, softer, deeper, ancient. A silence that belonged to the women who came before me, women who also knelt not out of surrender, but to reclaim what life had tried to take from them. I didn't pray with words. My mouth didn't open. But my heart began speaking in a language only those who have rebuilt themselves from dust understand. I remembered my grandmother kneeling whenever life tightened around her. I remembered the stories she told me about the women in our bloodline who found strength in positions the world mistook for defeat. Kneeling, in the eyes of the world, is weakness. But to the soul, kneeling is return. It is recollection. It is alignment. It is the moment when we stop fighting battles we cannot control and start fighting for the person we are inside. While I was there, my head tilted forward, my eyes burning but holding back tears, I felt a presence around me, something different, as if the house, the same house that had turned into a battlefield, was trying to hold me, as if the walls whispered that I still belonged, not in the conflict, but in the center of myself. I felt warmth on my back, as if old hands that once guided me without my noticing, were telling me to breathe. So I breathed. For the first time in a long time, I breathed without fearing that someone would twist my sigh into an offense. The cold floor beneath my knees seemed to pull out everything I had carried alone. It was as though the pain was leaving my chest and running down through my body, slipping through my skin and into the ground. And kneeling there, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to defend myself from absurd accusations. I didn't need to beg for understanding. I didn't need to fix what was never mine to fix. That knee on the floor wasn't defeat. It was freedom. It was the moment I stopped fighting to hold together something that no longer existed and started fighting not to lose myself in the middle of the destruction. A strange peace settled over me. A peace that made no sense considering the hurt I had just endured. But it was there, quiet, small, but real, as if whispering, "You are not alone." I closed my eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind them, I saw my mother clasping her hands the way she did when she needed strength. I saw my grandmother lifting her eyes toward the sky when the world pressed too hard. I saw Black women, strong, resilient, carrying more than they should, surviving because they knew when it was time to stop resisting and start rising again. If you've ever felt strength come from a place you couldn't explain, comment, "I recognize my ancestors," because that sentence can open doors inside someone who needs it. I felt the urge to apologize to myself, to say I was sorry for carrying so much, sorry for believing my love alone could heal his wounds, sorry for shrinking, sorry for going quiet, sorry for ignoring what my body had been trying to tell me for so long. And when that thought crossed my mind, a tear finally fell, not from sadness, but from release. It was as if I was finally seeing myself clearly, without fear, without filters, without excuses. And still on my knees, I realized something else. I was standing at the exact place between the end of one pain and the beginning of another. Strength. It was an invisible but powerful threshold where everything reorganized itself. He wasn't there to see it. He would never know what that moment meant to me, but he didn't need to, because that moment wasn't about him. It was about me, about how I would rise afterward, about how I would look at myself again with dignity, about choosing my peace over the war he kept bringing into the house. If this resonates with you, comment, "I choose my peace," and leave that phrase as a reminder for yourself. I stayed there for minutes that felt like hours. Time didn't exist. The house was quiet. The world was distant. And for the first time in a very long time, I was with myself. No fear, no rush, no need to fix what could not be fixed in that moment. It was just me and my breathing, me and my strength, me and the hands of my ancestry resting between my shoulder blades. And when I pressed my palms to the floor to rise again, my body was still weak, but my soul stood firmer than before. I didn't rise whole. I didn't rise healed. I didn't rise certain. I rose aware, and that changes everything. Because once awareness arrives, it doesn't leave. Once inner peace begins to grow, it no longer answers to someone else's anger. Once a mother stops trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved, she finally saves herself. And somewhere between the floor and my next breath, I understood. His war was never mine. It never belonged to me. I had only forgotten that in the middle of love, in the middle of pain, in the middle of hope. Now I remembered. Now I knew. Now I breathed differently. And I needed that new breath for what would come after. She didn't notice the change at first. It started small, almost invisible, like a whisper inside a storm. After so many days carrying that heavy pain, that constant fear, that sense of walking through an emotional battlefield inside her own home, the silence that came after the moment on her knees wasn't the same silence that hurt her before. This one was different. It didn't demand explanations. It didn't require defenses. It didn't ask for apologies. It didn't take her space. It gave her space. It wasn't emptiness. It was breathing room. Peace didn't arrive like lightning or with beauty or drama. It arrived like a hand on the shoulder of a tired woman saying, "Stay here for a minute." And in that minute, something inside her began to shift. That day was unlike all the others because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to predict his next outburst. She wasn't trying to figure out what to say. She wasn't rehearsing apologies. She wasn't preparing to take the blame for things she didn't cause. She wasn't shaping her behavior around a man whose moods moved like violent winds. She simply breathed, and she breathed in a way that made even her shoulders drop, as if realizing they had been carrying a weight she no longer needed to hold. The house was the same, the furniture in place, the objects that witnessed their entire story still sitting where they always had. But something inside her had been unchained. The war still existed outside of her, in his tone, in his sharp words, in his hardened posture, in his hostile silences. But for the first time, that war could no longer enter her as easily as before. She felt as if an invisible barrier had finally risen between his behavior and her heart. It wasn't indifference, it wasn't coldness, it wasn't letting it go. It was something else. It was discernment, a deep, painful understanding that she didn't have the power to heal whatever he carried inside his chest. That no matter how much love she had given, how many sacrifices she had made, how many nights she had stayed awake, how much she had tried to keep the peace, she could not change a person who refused to see himself. That realization hurt more than any shout, but at the same time, it brought a calm she had never felt before. Peace that grows from the inside often begins exactly like this, by recognizing your limits, by accepting that you cannot save someone who does not want to be saved, by having the courage to look at your own soul and say, "I am my responsibility now." That sentence echoed inside her like a wordless prayer, a quiet but powerful affirmation. If you feel you've reached this point in your life, comment, "I need to take care of myself." Sometimes writing that is the first step toward breaking cycles. Over the next days, she started observing herself more carefully. She would wake up and notice that her breathing felt different. She no longer woke up bracing herself for the worst. If the worst happened, she would breathe. If a harsh word came, she would breathe. If a door slammed, she would breathe. And in that breathing, she finally noticed something the chaos had kept her from seeing. She still existed. She still had life in her. Inside her still lived a woman who didn't deserve to be erased. A woman with history, with ancestry, with dignity, with worth. That realization reignited something she believed she had lost forever, the feeling of belonging to herself, the understanding that even in the middle of a battlefield, she had a right to peace. Not external peace, she knew that didn't depend on her, but inner peace, the kind built slowly, brick by brick, truth by truth, act of self-care by act of self-care. This peace didn't come from joy or sudden hope. It came from clarity, from the understanding that she couldn't keep carrying a weight that wasn't hers, from the emotional maturity only a woman who has walked through deep pain can reach. She started treating herself with more gentleness. Sometimes she made a cup of coffee just for herself and sat at the table without waiting for company, without hoping for conversation, without seeking approval. She sat and allowed the simple act of existing to be enough. She began listening to her own body again. When she was tired, she rested. When she was drained, she paused. When she was sad, she allowed the sadness without guilt. Along the way, she revived small spiritual rituals that had been forgotten under the weight of daily survival. She lit a candle now and then, not as a religious symbol, but as a reminder that there was still light inside her. She embraced silence, not out of fear anymore, but out of choice, the kind of silence that heals, that grounds, that protects. Her son kept his emotional outbursts, his sharp words, his war, but she no longer absorbed them the same way. She watched him and for the first time could see the wounded child behind the angry man, not to excuse him, but to free herself. Because when she understood that he lashed out at her because he knew she could take it, she also understood that continuing to take it was only feeding his emotional sickness, and she wasn't going to do that anymore. The truth didn't hurt less, but it set her free. She realized that inner peace isn't a spark or a sudden revelation or an epiphany. It's a process, a daily choice, a commitment to oneself, a commitment she had neglected because she'd been too busy trying to save someone who didn't value her. And it was in that quiet rebuilding, that gentle turning inward, that she started seeing her home differently. The space still held traces of war, still had scars, still had memories, but something inside her had shifted, and that shift started to change everything around her. She stopped responding to provocations, stopped explaining mistakes she didn't make, stopped apologizing just for existing, stopped trying to fix his bad moods with extra care. And as she stopped, the emotional impact began to shrink, not because he was getting better, but because she no longer stood in the line of fire. The war was still in the house, pounding on doors, pacing through hallways, speaking loudly. But her peace was coming from inside now, and that peace was untouchable. If you feel you need that peace, write, "I want peace for myself." Let that be a declaration, not a plea. She looked at herself in the mirror and noticed something new in her own eyes. It wasn't joy or bright hope or forced optimism. It was steadiness. It was a quiet strength that came from the understanding that she didn't need to destroy herself to keep anyone else standing. It was a soft but immense power, and that power allowed her to take a deep breath before walking through the living room, before stepping into the hallway, before looking at the house that had been the stage of so many silent battles. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but now, for the first time, she wasn't walking into it as a victim. She was walking into it as a woman who finally understood her own worth. And with that feeling, that blend of exhaustion, clarity, and inner strength, she realized that the path ahead would require courage, but not the old courage that screamed, that held everything together, that tried to control the uncontrollable. This was a different courage, the courage to release, to not absorb, to not react, the courage to keep living even in the middle of the war, because now she had discovered something that changed everything. True peace doesn't begin when the world gets better. It begins when we get better inside, and that peace was growing inside her, quiet, steady, necessary. He began facing his own shadow in the most painful way possible, through silence, not after a lecture, not after a fight, Not after I tried to explain what he had done to me. The change, the kind of change no one believes until they see it, started the exact moment he no longer found in me the wall he used to throw his frustrations against. Because when a mother stops responding, stops absorbing, stops justifying, stops putting out the emotional fires of her son, the son finally hears his own noise. And that's exactly what happened inside that house, tired of holding other people's battles. In the days following my inner silence, he began watching me differently. Not with disdain, not with the impatience that used to drip off him, but with something that looked like confusion. As if he was seeing a version of me he had never bothered to notice before. I kept doing my things calmly, breathing between tasks, moving without rushing to respond to provocations, and without walking like I was afraid of becoming his next target. And that new way of existing started to affect him. Not immediately. First came confusion, then discomfort, then his own silence. Not the angry silence from before, but a restless one, a silence that seemed almost guilty. He began noticing that I no longer rushed to the living room when he arrived, no longer tried to please, no longer asked if he was okay, no longer tiptoed around the house like someone trying not to wake a monster. I moved like someone who had found her center again, and for someone used to controlling the entire emotional climate of the home, that kind of shift is disturbing. At times, I caught him observing me from across the room, his expression heavy, as if trying to understand when it was that he lost the control he thought he had. And the more he watched me, the more his own shadow rose to the surface, because there was no longer anyone standing between him and the truth he had avoided for so long. Then came the small moments of introspection. I saw it in the way he sat on the couch, in how he held his phone but wasn't really looking at the screen, in the long stares at the floor. He seemed unsettled, uncomfortable inside his own skin, and I noticed in the details that this discomfort wasn't about me, it was about him. It was as if he were listening to his own conscience for the first time in ages. He began replaying each explosion, each harsh word, each unjust moment. And now that I didn't react, now that I didn't shrink the way he was used to, now that my silence didn't come from fear, but from strength, he finally began seeing himself for who he had been. One day, I noticed him standing in the doorway of the hallway, watching me for what had to be more than 30 seconds. It wasn't anger, it was a lost look, the look of someone who realizes they crossed a line they had no right to touch, the look of someone finally feeling guilt knock on the door. I kept doing what I was doing, not looking at him, not offering comfort, not giving him any emotional escape. And that was exactly the point. Because when you stop offering automatic comfort to someone who hurts you, they're forced to face the mess they created on their own. Days went by, and I sensed something shifting in him. He started speaking less, not out of coldness, but reflection. His responses came slower, more thoughtful. Sometimes he seemed ready to start a conversation, but swallowed the words. Other times, he began a sentence and stopped midway, as if reconsidering what he was about to say. That was his shadow, rising, not as a monster, but as a wound. The wound he had never faced, the wound he always dumped on me because I was the safest target, the easiest target, the target he believed would never leave. If you understand this kind of pain, write in the comments. I carried pain that wasn't mine. It became even clearer when one evening he came home and didn't shout, didn't complain, didn't slam a single door. He simply walked in, set his keys on the table, and stood still, as if searching for the courage to meet my eyes. I was sitting down, reading something simple, breathing with the peace I had been building inside myself. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. And right then, I knew he was ashamed, deeply ashamed, not of me, of himself. A son feeling shame in front of his mother is no small thing. It's devastating. He began carrying that expression of someone who knows they went too far, but doesn't know how to return. I didn't say anything. I didn't make it easy. I didn't soften the moment. I didn't offer comfort, because I knew this process had to be his. His shadow needed to be faced by him, not by me. And the more I stayed firm, the more that shadow became visible to him. I could see in his eyes that every cruel word he had ever thrown at me was now echoing back at him, like a painful reminder he couldn't silence. Sometimes I saw him rubbing his face, exhaling heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose, signs of emotional exhaustion, signs of an internal battle, signs of someone finally recognizing the damage they caused to the person who loved them the most. And that realization isn't pretty, it isn't gentle, it isn't light. It's a kind of pain that only grows when a person realizes the blame can no longer be placed on anyone else. Then one day he came into my room without warning, something he used to do aggressively. But this time, he walked in slowly, like someone stepping onto sacred ground. He opened the door hesitantly, eyes lowered, and said something I never imagined hearing from the same man who had turned our home into a battlefield. Mom. Just that. Only Mom. But in that single word lived regret, hesitation, his entire shadow trembling, exposed, looking for somewhere to land. I didn't respond right away. I waited. He inhaled deeply, his eyes reddened, and he whispered, "I don't know what's happening to me." And that was the moment I knew he was finally seeing his own darkness. He wasn't searching for excuses. He wasn't placing the blame on me. He wasn't twisting the narrative. He was looking inward for the first time. His pain was surfacing, his confusion, his bruised pride, his fear of opening up, his guilt for words he couldn't take back. The shadow that had always lived inside him was now illuminated by the silence I had chosen. And when light hits a shadow, there's no pretending it isn't there. This continued for days. He talked less, but felt more, observed more, reflected more. I watched him replay scenes, rethink decisions, reorganize memories. Sometimes he'd walk past me looking like he wanted to apologize, but the words stayed stuck. Other times he stood in the kitchen staring at his own feet, like someone trying to gather the courage to take the first right step after many wrong ones. His change didn't come overnight, but it began. It began because I stopped absorbing pain that wasn't mine. It began because I stopped trying to save a man who needed to learn how to save himself. It began because he finally had to face his own shadow. And when a person looks closely at their shadow, transformation becomes unavoidable. If this part speaks to you, write in the comments, "Who needs to change?" Will feel it. And in that house that had witnessed so much war, a different battle began for the very first time, his battle with himself. She took a long breath after everything she told, the kind of breath a person takes when they finally allow the body to rest in a safe place. But that pause wasn't closure. It wasn't a door shutting. It wasn't a final chapter. It was simply the moment when the soul makes it clear that her journey continues, and that yours continues too. Because stories like this don't end when the video ends. They keep echoing inside the people who hear them. They stir old memories. They awaken strength in places that felt empty. They clean wounds that were never named. And if there's one thing you need to understand right now, at this very moment, it's that your life deserves that same strength. Your path deserves that same clarity. Your soul deserves that same freedom. The peace she found didn't come from miracles, from pretty words, or from sudden change. It came from decision, from courage, from self-awareness, from admitting she could no longer live hooked to someone else's moods, someone else's instability, someone else's emotional demands. And maybe, while listening to this story, some part of you recognized that same calling. The part of you that's tired of carrying too much. The part that's tired of asking permission to exist. The part that's tired of trying to prove something to people who never saw your real worth. The part that's tired of surviving inside wars you never started. That's why the journey doesn't end here. Yours continues. And it continues asking you to get closer to your strength, your story, your truth. And you don't have to walk that path alone. This channel exists for that. To be shelter when the world is heavy, to be clarity when life tightens around you, to be light when your heart darkens. Every video here is created to reach deep layers, layers no one sees, layers you've never had the space to speak out loud. And the deeper you go, the more you discover the woman inside you who has not finished rising, has not finished understanding herself, has not finished rebuilding her foundation. And that's exactly why the next video appearing on your screen right now matters so much. It's not a continuation of this story, because each story has its own time, its own soul, its own path, but it is a continuation of your transformation. It's your next step, your next key, another layer of your strength that needs to be awakened, another point inside you waiting to be understood, another chapter of this emotional journey you deserve to walk with awareness, with self-respect, with emotional maturity, with the calm that grows only when you finally understand your life is worth far more than the behavior of the people who hurt you. The video beside this one is calling you because it speaks to another part of you, the part that needs discernment, the part that needs clarity, the part that needs to understand your limits, your emotional independence, your choices, your energy, the part that needs to breathe, not like someone waiting for permission, but like someone who knows she deserves peace. And when you click on it, you're not just watching another piece of content. You are feeding your spirit. You are strengthening your mind. You are caring for your story. You are honoring your hurts, your victories, your falls, your rebirths. And let me tell you something with absolute firmness. Women like you do not deserve to live on autopilot. You don't deserve to live dimmed. You don't deserve to live in anyone's shadow. Women like you deserve awareness. You deserve clarity. You deserve emotional leadership over your own life. You deserve to know where to place your energy and where to pull your soul back. And that's exactly why you need to move on to the next video. Not to see what happens, but because your healing journey cannot stop here. What you feel matters, what you're living matters, and what you choose from this moment forward shapes everything. So let this final image of this story settle inside you. The image of her rising from the floor with a strength no one imagined she had. Let that be your mirror, because now you are the one who needs to rise. You are the one who needs to keep walking. You are the one who needs to continue learning. Don't let this story end in you as if it were just another video. Let it create space inside you. Let it reorganize your awareness. Let it cleanse the weight you've carried for years. Let it prepare your heart for what comes next. And when you're ready, and you are, click on the next video appearing on your screen. It's waiting for you because it was made for you, because your story isn't over, because your strength is still growing, and because the next word that will change your life is right there.